Deep in the unforgiving rainforests of the Amazon, beyond the reach of modern civilization, lies a ritual so bizarre, so dangerous, that it's almost impossible to believe it ever truly happened. A forgotten tribe, a sacred rite of passage, and a substance so potent, so deadly, that even the smallest misstep could mean death or madness. They called it the voice of the serpent, a ceremonial drink derived from the venom of a jungle viper, mixed with hallucinogenic plants known to warp time, unravel identity, and tear the mind from the body. This was no act of recreational spirituality. It was a test of faith, a confrontation with death itself. Young warriors were forced to drink it, then buried alive, left to speak with the gods beneath the earth. Some never woke up. Others came back, changed. But all of them believed they'd met something ancient, something terrifying, something divine. This is the shocking story of the Yurupari cult, one of the most extreme spiritual practices in human history, and the deadly cocktail that opened a door to the other side. What was real? What was hallucination? And what did they truly see when the venom took hold? Let's begin. Hidden within the depths of the northwestern Amazon, where the rivers coil like snakes and the trees form cathedrals of shadow and silence, there lived a people few outsiders had ever seen, the Tucano tribes. But within their many branches, a darker lineage existed, a secret brotherhood, one that would become known to anthropologists much later as the Yurupari cult. To the Western mind, it might seem impossible that such a thing could have existed, much less thrived for centuries. But for these tribes, the ritual was sacred, divine, and utterly non-negotiable. It began at puberty. A boy was chosen, not for strength, not for intelligence, but for silence. A child who had never questioned the elders, never spoken out of turn, never broken a taboo. These were the ones believed to be ready to meet the serpent. He was brought before the shaman, painted with charcoal, red clay, and the blood of animals. His body, a canvas. His soul, a vessel. There was no warning, no explanation. He was told only this: tonight, you will meet the gods, and you must return with their voice. What followed was more than a rite of passage. It was psychological warfare masked as religion. First came the isolation. The initiate was taken into the forest, far from the village. There, under torchlight, the elders danced and chanted, summoning what they believed was the spiritual embodiment of the snake god Yurupari, a being of chaos, fire, and divine wrath. Then came the drink, a black, tar-like brew, thick, putrid, alive with the venom of the Bothrops atrox, a highly venomous pit viper native to the Amazon basin. This snake's bite is often fatal. Its venom destroys tissue, causes internal bleeding, and triggers hallucinations as the brain swells from the trauma. But the shamans had learned how to distill that venom, not to kill, but to open doors. They combined it with ayahuasca vines, datura flowers, and other psychoactive plants only they knew how to harvest without consequence. What emerged from their cauldrons wasn't medicine. It was revelation or madness. The boy drank, and then he was buried alive, not under soil, but beneath woven palm mats and layers of thick jungle leaves. A shallow grave designed to trap heat, isolate sound, and simulate death. For hours, sometimes days, he would remain in that makeshift tomb, alone with the venom boiling in his blood, alone with the visions. No food, no water, only the sound of his own pulse, and the voice of the serpent that would eventually begin to speak. In his mind, the jungle came alive. Trees whispered his name. Dead ancestors rose from the roots. And the gods, twisted and faceless, demanded obedience or sacrifice. Some boys screamed so loudly they had to be restrained. Others clawed their faces until the skin came off. Some went silent and never spoke again. But the ones who survived were changed. When they emerged from the burial mat, eyes sunken, bodies drenched in sweat, they were no longer boys. They were chosen. The elders would look into their eyes and ask just one question: did you hear the voice? If they said yes, they were welcomed as new initiates into the cult. If they said no, they were given the drink again. Sometimes twice, sometimes 5 times, sometimes until their minds cracked under the pressure. Death was common, but so was resurrection. For the Yurupari believed that true knowledge of the gods could only come through dying and returning. They believed the venom was sacred because it killed the ego. and in its place, the gods would whisper instructions. But what were those instructions? What was the purpose of this brutal ritual? It wasn't just about contact with the divine. It was control. Only those who had passed the trial could lead, could speak, could marry, could hunt. The venom didn't just open minds, it created hierarchy. And the elders guarded this secret with terrifying zeal. According to missionary records and rare tribal testimonies, any boy who tried to refuse the ceremony or speak of its inner rituals to women or outsiders was beaten, exiled, or worse. Because to them, Yurupari wasn't just a god. He was a weapon, and the ritual was their insurance that no man, woman, or child would ever question the chain of power. But the madness of the jungle had a price, and even those who survived often paid it for the rest of their lives. Some were haunted by visions they couldn't explain. Some became violent. Some believed they could no longer die. And the elders, they believed that was proof it had worked. Because only the gods could drive a man mad. And only those touched by gods were worthy of leading others into darkness. But what made the Yurupari ritual truly horrifying wasn't the suffering it caused. It was the precision behind it. The structure. The generational planning. This wasn't chaos. It was doctrine. A doctrine of blood. Of venom. Of silence. And the deeper one looks into its origins, the more chilling the questions become. Because somewhere in that rainforest, someone had to discover this process first. Someone had to drink the venom and survive. Who was the first to meet the serpent? And what did they see? The jungle doesn't forgive mistakes. And the Yurupari cult knew this better than anyone. To the untrained eye, the process of creating their sacred brew might look like random chaos. Tribesmen boiling leaves in giant pots, snakes being milked for venom, and bark being scraped into dark, bubbling mixtures. But in truth, it was one of the most dangerously precise chemical rituals on Earth. It began with the serpent, the Bothrops atrox, also known as the common lancehead or fer-de-lance, is one of the deadliest snakes in South America. Its venom doesn't kill immediately. It eats you alive from the inside. Hemorrhaging, necrosis, convulsions. Yet the Yurupari shamans didn't fear it. They revered it. Captured with ritualistic care, these vipers were kept in bone cages deep in the jungle, fed birds and rodents, and watched for signs, from subtle movement patterns to how they shed their skin. Only certain snakes were chosen. Not the largest, not the most venomous, the angriest, the ones that struck without warning, the ones that hissed for hours. They were considered to be filled with the purest spirit of Yurupari. When the time came, the shamans would gather. In silence. At night, they approached the snake, not with fear, but reverence. They would sing to it, not to calm it, but to provoke it. They wanted the venom full of rage, full of wrath. Using a carved bamboo funnel and bone mesh cloth, they'd extract the venom, drop by drop, into a dried gourd. But that was only the beginning. On its own, snake venom is lethal. It needed to be transformed, made spiritual. This is where the brew became truly demonic. The base was a concoction of Banisteriopsis caapi, the ayahuasca vine, combined with Psychotria vortis leaves, both known to produce intense visions when consumed together. But the Yurupari added far more dangerous ingredients. They infused the venom with brugmansia, or angel's trumpet, a plant that induces delirium, amnesia, and even episodes of psychotic rage. Then came Virola theodora bark, which contains dimethyltryptamine, DMT, the most powerful hallucinogen known to science. But the final, secret ingredient was the resin of the karori vine, a paralyzing agent traditionally used on blow darts. In high doses, it stops the heart. In small doses, it slows the body, just enough to make you feel buried alive, even if you're not. These elements, combined with the venom, created what the shamans called the river of death. The brew was boiled down over days in ceremonial cauldrons, watched constantly by elder women who chanted to keep away spirits. Each pot was stirred in a specific pattern, always counterclockwise, to prevent evil from entering. During the boiling, the air would become toxic. Fumes from the plants caused those nearby to hallucinate. Some tribes described seeing faces in the steam, ghosts of former initiates, crying or laughing or whispering secrets. The final liquid was thick, sludge-like, a deep black green, with a scent that mixed decay, iron, and something sweet, like rotting fruit. And still, They drank it. But here's where the Yurupari cult separated itself from every other psychedelic culture on Earth. Most civilizations used hallucinogens to heal, to speak with ancestors, to connect with nature. The Yurupari used it to destroy. This wasn't about enlightenment. It was about breaking a human being down to the core, shattering identity, severing the soul from the body, and flooding the mind with fear, chaos, and gods that whispered in impossible tongues. They believed the only way to touch the divine was through pain. The brew wasn't just administered in ceremony, it was forced. Young initiates were gagged to prevent vomiting, their hands tied to prevent seizure-induced injury, their eyes blindfolded so the visions couldn't be broken. And then, the silence began. For hours, nothing. Then, the screaming. Men who had drunk the venom brew often reported the sensation of falling through the earth, of being eaten alive by snakes, of watching their own skin rot, of hearing a voice, low, ancient, and commanding, tell them the exact moment they would die. Some claimed to see their village burning. Others saw dead children with snake eyes. Some said they became the snake. Anthropologists who later interviewed survivors were stunned by the consistency of these visions across generations, despite different individuals, different doses, and different time periods. How could that be? How could hallucinations be shared? One theory suggests the venom triggered genetic memory, primal imagery encoded into the brain. Others believe it was suggestion, a psychological echo of elder stories planted in the minds of children. But the cult didn't care for theories. They cared for results. And what mattered was this. Once someone drank the brew, they were never the same. They walked differently, spoke differently, dreamed differently. They had touched the gods and survived. But survival came at a cost. Many who completed the ritual developed permanent symptoms: insomnia, paranoia, visual distortions, even epilepsy. One elder was said to have clawed out his own eyes after seeing snakes wrapped around the sun. Another never spoke again, simply rocking in place until the day he died. To outsiders, these were symptoms of poisoning. To the Yurupari, they were signs of divine presence. But as word of the ritual spread, through traders, through captives, through whispers in the jungle, it eventually reached the ears of a different kind of power. A power that had no tolerance for venom or visions. A power that believed only one God was real, and that everything else was evil. What happens when you stare too long into the abyss, and the abyss starts whispering back? For the Yurupari cult, madness wasn't a side effect. It was a requirement. They believed that to truly hear the gods, the mind must be broken, shattered like a clay pot, so the divine could flow in through the cracks. But in the eyes of outsiders, missionaries, anthropologists, early explorers, what they found in the jungle wasn't spirituality. It was something closer to a mass psychosis. Reports emerged of men wandering naked into rivers and drowning themselves while laughing. Children who refused to eat, claiming the food was full of eyes. Women waking in the night to find their husbands standing over them with knives, whispering that the serpent demanded sacrifice. These weren't isolated cases. This was a pattern. And it wasn't just the initiates. Even the shamans, those who brewed the venom and led the ceremonies, often showed signs of cognitive decay. Slurred speech, sudden rage, visual hallucinations in broad daylight. Was it spiritual possession, or slow, creeping poisoning? Science offers a grim possibility. Snake venom contains neurotoxins, chemicals that bind to nerve receptors and interfere with the body's ability to communicate with itself. Combined with the cocktail of psychotropic plants used in the Yurupari brew, this could lead to long-term brain damage, especially in repeat users. And many shamans weren't just tasting the brew once or twice. They were drinking it for decades. That's not religion. That's chemical warfare, on your own mind. Western doctors who studied similar Amazonian compounds in the 20th century found evidence of dopamine disruption, serotonin overload, and hippocampal erosion, the very structures that control memory, emotion, and fear. Which means the Yurupari weren't just opening a door to the gods. They were opening a door to permanent mental alteration. But within the cult, this madness was nurtured. In fact, it was encouraged. Because once someone had crossed the threshold, once their mind no longer functioned according to normal reality, they became living proof of the gods' power. These were the marked ones, the tongues of Yurupari. Some were kept in special huts, fed by virgins, worshipped as mouthpieces for the divine. Their ramblings were recorded, memorized, and even turned into prophecy. One man, known only as the Serpent's Eye, spent his last 10 years blind, screaming day and night that the rivers would rise and the sky would bleed. When an unusually deadly monsoon hit 2 years later, wiping out 3 neighboring villages, he was declared a true seer. But prophecy wasn't the only thing the madness offered. It also offered fear, a psychological weapon used by cult elders to maintain total control. Children were told that if they spoke during the ceremonies, the serpent would crawl into their mouths and suffocate them from the inside. Women who asked questions about the ritual were accused of tempting Yurupari's wrath and cast into the forest to survive alone. And any man who doubted the visions, who questioned whether the gods were real, was forced to drink twice the dose. Not to convince him, but to erase him. This wasn't faith. This was indoctrination by trauma. And still, the cult thrived. Because in the jungle, power protects itself. The more terrifying the rite, the more sacred it becomes. And for the tribes trapped under the rule of Yurupari, madness wasn't a curse. It was the currency of obedience. But then, something shifted. Around the early 1700s, stories began circulating in European missionary networks of a demonic forest cult in the Amazon, one that practiced mass poisoning, child entombment, and serpent worship through intoxication. Most dismissed it as exaggerated, until the Jesuits went in. They were trained, resourced, and determined to root out what they saw as savage heresy. What they found broke them. Letters from the earliest missions describe scenes that read like horror fiction. Men with teeth sharpened into fangs, speaking in reversed languages. Bodies covered in tattoos of snakes coiled around skulls. Children vomiting blood during initiation feasts. And one missionary swore that he saw a man buried alive, smiling as the earth covered his face. The Jesuits called it a hell cult, a jungle inferno built on hallucination and heresy. They tried to stop it. They burned ceremonial huts, confiscated brews, tore down totem poles and snake altars. But every time they left, the rituals returned. Because the madness wasn't just in the brew. It was in the people, passed down like memory, whispered like bedtime stories. And more disturbingly, it was starting to spread. Captured tribes began mimicking the Yurupari rites, brewing their own versions of the Venom drink, even in diluted forms. The jungle wasn't silencing the madness. It was multiplying it. What the Jesuits called demonic may, in retrospect, have been the earliest evidence of cultural viral transmission, an idea so powerful, so fearsome, it leapt from mind to mind like wildfire. But if that was the case, what exactly was the original idea? Was it simply control? Was it trauma disguised as theology? Or was there something deeper, some primal truth buried beneath the visions, something the rest of the world was too afraid to see? The missionaries had one more weapon to use. They would bring the full weight of the Catholic Church, colonial armies, and European medicine into the jungle. They would burn the snake god from the forest, once and for all. But as they were about to learn, you can't kill what lives in the mind. In the year 1740, Father Matteo de Lacerda stepped off a riverboat and into the sweltering green hell of the Amazon. A crucifix hung around his neck, a Bible in his hand, and a letter from the Jesuit order charging him with a divine mission: eradicate the cult of Yurupari, convert the savage, cleanse the jungle of its demons. He was one of dozens, Jesuits, Franciscans, Dominicans, sent over the course of a century into the darkest reaches of South America. But unlike his predecessors, Father Lacerda kept a meticulous journal. What he wrote down would later be banned by the church. He described arriving in a village where no one would speak, not out of rudeness, but fear. Their mouths stayed closed, eyes fixed to the earth. Children clung to their mothers, who refused to make eye contact with the foreign priest. Then came the dreams. The local chieftain warned Father Lacerda not to stay overnight. But he did. And in the night, he claimed to hear a hissing voice inside his skull. He awoke with his bedsheets soaked in blood. His own nose had bled through the night. He called it spiritual attack, but the villagers called it welcoming. This was just one of dozens of encounters missionaries recorded, each more disturbing than the last. One priest claimed he watched a boy convulse and speak in fluent Latin, despite the tribe having no exposure to European languages. Another swore he found a shaman's hut filled with drawings of a serpent coiled around the cross, each image smeared with animal blood. But it wasn't just the visions that disturbed them. It was the organization. Contrary to the idea of wild, disorganized paganism, the Yurupari cult operated like a military religion. There were ranks, roles, rules. Shamans acted as high priests. Young boys were conscripted into silence. Women were forbidden from knowing even the shape of the ceremonial flutes used during the rituals. If a woman heard the flutes, she was considered cursed. If she saw them, she could be executed. Father Lacerda wrote, "This is not ignorance. It is heresy with structure, demonic theology." Yet despite their efforts, missionaries made little progress. Why? Because fear was stronger than faith. The tribes didn't fear hell or sin. They feared Yurupari, and they feared what happened to those who rejected him. The missionaries, armed with books and crucifixes, found themselves facing a belief system far more intimate than any dogma they'd known. The jungle didn't preach, it possessed. And the venom didn't argue, it showed. Even among converted tribes, relapse into the old rites was common. Some would attend Sunday Mass in the morning and drink the venom brew at sunset. One missionary, Father Isidro, was so desperate to understand the allure that he drank the brew himself. He never spoke again. He wandered into the jungle days later and was never found. His replacement, Father Villanueva, publicly declared the Yurupari ritual a satanic sacrament and requested military intervention. And Rome agreed. By the late 1700s, entire expeditionary units were being sent upriver, not to preach, but to purge. Villages were burned. Shamans were hanged. Ceremonial artifacts destroyed. To some, this was justice. To others, it was cultural genocide. But something strange happened in the aftermath. As missionaries began to dominate the region, the ritual disappeared, but the visions remained. New generations of children, born into Christian villages, still reported dreams of the serpent, still drew the god coiled around the stars, still whispered in languages no one remembered teaching them. It was as if the jungle wouldn't let go. Even European settlers, those who had no connection to the tribe, began reporting night terrors, feelings of being watched in the forest, and an overwhelming fear of snakes. One plantation owner wrote in 1823, "I've begun to dream of a man with no skin, whose body is covered in eyes. He tells me I do not belong here, that I will be swallowed." Was it residual trauma, psychological imprinting, or something darker? Anthropologists now speculate that the venom brew, used for generations, may have left epigenetic effects on descendants. That is, the trauma and hallucinations may have rewritten certain expressions of DNA, passing emotional and neural hypersensitivity down the line. Meaning the Yurupari cult didn't just survive in memory. It survived in blood. But the most chilling discovery came in 1987. An expedition into the Rio Vopes region, one of the last frontiers of the Amazon, stumbled upon an isolated tribe previously unknown to modern science. They had no contact with the outside world. No written language. No metal tools. But they had the ritual. They buried their young boys beneath mats. They drank a brew made of vines, bark, and dried venom sacs. And they chanted the name Yurupari, thousands of miles from the old missionary routes, centuries after the cult had supposedly been wiped out. And yet it lived on. This wasn't folklore. This wasn't myth. This was persistence. Proof that something in that jungle, something beyond doctrine, beyond civilization, refused to die. And as we peer into the ruins of that time, as we examine the fragments left behind, the serpent totems, the buried flutes, the stained cauldrons, we're left with one terrifying question. If all our gods are born of fear, what kind of god needs you to drink poison just to hear his voice? The jungle keeps its secrets, but sometimes it whispers. And if you listen closely, you begin to hear what they heard, see what they saw. Because the visions granted by the Yurupari brew weren't random. They weren't merely the product of toxins misfiring in the brain. They followed patterns, terrifying, vivid patterns, repeating across time, geography, and generations. Survivors, those who had drunk the venom and returned, spoke of eerily similar experiences. They described a chamber of vines, where the earth breathed like lungs. A serpent with no eyes, whose voice was a low rumble, like thunder underwater. And most disturbingly, they all described the same three questions being asked in their minds. What are you? Who sent you? Do you wish to remain? No initiate could ever answer all three. Those who tried often lost consciousness mid-vision. Others claimed they couldn't remember what they had said, and some refused to speak of the experience ever again. But the elders interpreted this as divine selection. Only those who responded correctly, whatever correct meant, were seen as truly chosen. Anthropologists, skeptics, and neurobiologists have all struggled to explain this. How could hallucinations contain such structure? Why were the same symbols, snakes eating themselves, trees weeping blood, the chamber of vines, universal among so many tribes, across so much time? One controversial theory was proposed by ethnobotanist Dr. Helena Varga in 1992, the idea of a shared biospiritual consciousness, an organic, chemical network in the Amazon, through which knowledge and imagery pass across human minds via the ingestion of specific compounds. In other words, the jungle itself was speaking through the brew. DMT, the primary active ingredient in many of the plants used by the Yurupari, is found naturally in the human brain and in thousands of species of flora. When activated, especially in high doses, it creates intense, often terrifying encounters with what users describe as entities, intelligences, or architects. Modern users of DMT report meetings with glowing serpents, pulsing geometric shapes, and beings that communicate telepathically. But the Yurupari ritual predated modern DMT exploration by centuries. And they weren't microdosing. They were pushing the body to the brink of chemical death. It begs the question, were they hallucinating or contacting something real? One tale, passed down from generation to generation in the Vopes region, tells of a boy who drank the brew and never came back. Not physically, but mentally. His body returned, but he could no longer speak his tribe's language. He drew symbols in the dirt, concentric circles, jagged lines, stars bent into impossible shapes. He babbled in tongues, but not aimlessly. His speech followed syntax, rhythm, and apparent grammar. Years later, a linguist claimed it resembled a blend of Proto-Carib and extinct Andean dialects, none of which the boy could have known. Was it memory unlocked? Or a foreign language injected by the vision? But perhaps the most terrifying legacy of the Yurupari visions came not from the jungle, but from the Christian converts who tried to reconcile their old gods with the new. In 1841, a Jesuit chronicler recorded the words of a man who had completed the Venom rite and converted to Christianity. He said, "In the drink, I met a god of fire. He stood with no face. He said, 'Your cross is a mirror, and what you see in it is me.'" The priest dismissed it as heresy, but it reveals a deeper, more disturbing truth. The Yurupari wasn't just a jungle god. He was a manifestation of the self under chemical dissection. He showed you what you feared most, because he was you. Every hallucination, every vision of death, every whisper of snakes beneath the skin, all reflections of a mind broken wide open, with nothing to protect it. There were no filters, no comforts, no walls, just raw consciousness, staring into an abyss shaped like a serpent. And for many, what they saw changed them forever. One elder, before dying, described his final vision as a child. "I walked through a river of teeth. At the end, I saw my mother's face. But her eyes were holes, and from them came snakes. She said, 'You are born again, but not for this world.'" When asked what it meant, he said only, "The jungle does not lie." Today, remnants of the Yurupari cult still exist. Hidden rituals, secret flutes, dark whispers passed from grandfather to grandson. But the brew, the venom, the voice of the serpent, has become rare, hunted, feared even by those who once revered it. Yet it hasn't disappeared. In 2017, a team of biologists encountered an isolated tribe that refused all contact. Days after they left, one of the researchers began experiencing violent seizures. He later described dreams of the coiled god, and died weeks later from what doctors could only describe as systemic neurochemical collapse. No toxin was ever found. Just one word, etched on his notebook in shaky handwriting: Yurupari. And so, we're left with this final truth. The jungle gave birth to a god of madness. A god who spoke in visions. A god you could only meet by dying and coming back. Whether it was a spirit, a hallucination, or something buried deep in the human psyche, it changed every person who faced it. And it still waits, coiled in the dark, for the next one who dares to drink. The story of the Yurupari cult is not just a bizarre footnote in the margins of history. It is a mirror, a reflection of how far humans are willing to go to touch the divine, even if it means risking their sanity, their lives, or their souls. To the Western mind, this was madness. To the missionaries, it was evil. To the Yurupari, it was truth. And maybe, in some twisted way, it still is. Because the idea behind it, that suffering opens doors, that pain invites visions, that death is not an end but a gate, has echoed in religions and cults across the world, from the shamans of Siberia to the mystics of India to the flagellants of medieval Europe. But none drank snake venom. None buried their children alive to meet gods made of fire and silence. And yet, across centuries, across languages, they all saw the same serpent. So the next time you dream of snakes, or feel something watching you in the dark, ask yourself, is it just imagination? Or is the jungle still whispering? If this story gripped you, shocked you, or made you question what's real, subscribe for more history that was never meant to be remembered. Drop a comment below. Would you drink the venom? And check out the next story, because the past is always darker than you think. Final thought: some doors, once opened, never close.